So Rupert Everett, The Happy Prince, has been a real passion project of yours for about a decade now, as far as I know. You wrote the screenplay, you directed it, and you star in it. Take us back to the beginning. What about this story? What about the life of Oscar Wilde inspired you to commit your talents both in front of and behind the camera, and to keep at it until the film finally was made?
Basically trying to write a great role for myself, and Oscar Wilde seemed like a perfect portrait to try and paint, because I find him a very fascinating, inspiring, patron saint kind of figure, almost a Christ figure, and that's really how it happened.
Well, you've played Wilde before in a revival of the David Hare play, The Judas Kiss. You've also acted in screen adaptations of some of his works, like Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband. What about him fascinated you? What about him drew you to him?
Drew me to him. Everything really. His genius, the fact that he was imprisoned for being a homosexual with hard labor, and that his exile was also another kind of imprisonment, the fact that he is the last great vagabond of the 19th century, the fact that he... that noise.
I think there's a leaf blower, sorry.
All those things, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's a lot of different things you can focus on in the life of this man. You center this mostly on the last few years of his life. As you were writing the screenplay, how did you arrive at using that as sort of a framing device for this story?
Partly because the other three films about Oscar Wilde deal with this period before prison, so I wanted to have some virgin territory. And secondly, because it's a period that I adore, and I love him in exile. He's living his life without compromise. He's getting on with it. He refuses to be pushed down, and all of that is very inspiring to me.
Well, as you were working on this script, can you talk a bit about how it developed over the years while you were trying to make this film? No?
It didn't really. We wrote it right at the beginning. I wrote it at the beginning. It took about 2 months, I suppose, to write, and it got reduced as the process went on, particularly when we got into a final budget situation. But I never changed or rewrote the script, to be honest.
Well, talk a bit about directing the film and what I guess, this is your directorial debut. So what were you looking to, I should say, as, I guess, influences? Did you call upon, various directors that you have worked with in your past as sort of as a way of, as a technique for working? What were you looking to for inspiration?
I think I was inspired by the films of a couple of Belgian directors called the Dardenne brothers. I was inspired, obviously, by more classical films, by Visconti, in terms of the aesthetic texture of his films. But I think when you're making a film yourself, you really have to hopefully have your own idea, and you should just probably be thinking about how you want to express yourself rather than trying to ape other people in a way.
Well, then talk a bit about what your ultimate, I guess, approach to the material was and how you wanted to visually represent the life of Oscar Wilde.
Well, I wanted the protagonist to have a relationship with the camera somehow. He looks at the camera at the beginning of the film and explains really to the audience that the film is a kind of dream. And then the camera hopefully has developed by this stage, when the actor looks directly into it, a kind of personality of its own. And then the camera follows the actor in a kind of handheld type of modus operandi or punctuation into where he's going, the depths, in the case of Oscar Wilde. And I hope, or my hope was, that it brings a more intimate experience to the place, to the characters, and that sort of thing. The Dardenne brothers, for example, use the backs of actors a lot, as much as they use the front of actors. And this is a fascinating thing to play with and to use. So I had a lot of my camera following me as the actor, and I think it gives a certain flavor and taste to the film.
Mhm. Now, since you're also starring in this film as well, how do you make those decisions about your own performance? You know, because obviously, when you're working with another director, you have somebody who can guide you and tell you, well, that's not quite right. Try it this way. So, how are you able to, as both a director and star, make those decisions for yourself?
Well, I suppose in one sense it was made easier for me because I wrote the script for myself with my own acting abilities or disabilities in the forefront of my mind, and so I knew the script inside out. I'd been in the Judas Kiss. I knew the character inside out. For me, the acting side of it was quite second nature. Pace was my issue probably because. I sometimes went too fast, but purely because I was so keen to get through with the day and get on to the next scene. And I sometimes in the edit had to unpick my speedy pace. Pace, I think, for an actor is more important in a way than characterization, because pace is what gives you a proper relationship with the audience. The audience will enjoy you at the right pace. They'll be bored by you if your pace is too slow, and they'll be bemused if it's too fast. And so I think one of the actor's main jobs is to get the pace right. And sometimes I got that wrong because of being the director, I suppose, and trying to make the days work and finish them off fast enough. But I was able to unpick it in the edit.
Talk a bit about you have a lot of great actors filling this film as well, starring opposite you, people like Colin Firth, Tom Wilkinson, Emily Watson. Since you've been an actor all this time, how do you work with other actors? How do you draw performances out of them?
Do you know what? I think most actors love to be left alone and to get on with their performances themselves. Micromanagement of actors from directors, I always, I think most actors find really hard to deal with. An actor blossoms most if he's allowed to find his own way, and again, the director's work with an actor, the main part of it is done in casting him, because once you've cast him, you've kind of got the actor, and hopefully you've cast the person who's perfect to play the role. And so all my actors were amazing, very, very good actors. I didn't have to micromanage anybody's performance really. They all knew what they were doing, and they were able to be very supportive to me, I suppose.
Well, I guess it also helps that many of these people you've co-starred with before.
Absolutely.
They've been attached to this movie about as long as you have, right? I mean, so they have as much a dedication to the project as I'm sure you did.
Yes, I suppose it was a very personal film like that. I knew everyone pretty well, and I think that was great, very lucky for me to have all of them.
Mm-hmm.
If there'd been an actor that I'd had to micromanage and really pull a performance out of, I think the whole thing would have shifted into a much more delicate and complicated scenario.
Right. One of the things that this movie does really well is recreate the period, really put you in there into the time that Wilde was alive, or about to die, I should say. As a director, I mean, can you talk about some of the research that you did, some of, working with your craftspeople behind the camera to, put the audience in that period?
Well, it was quite a challenge in a way, because most of the money for the film came out of Germany, out of Bavaria, the state of Bavaria, in which all the architecture is completely different to French architecture. And so, and also very restored, because it's a quite wealthy state. And I didn't have money to make the film in the studio. So finding rooms to use was very difficult. I found on my travels, I was doing a series in the Czech Republic, and I went over the border one day with this guy, and we found these 3 old castles with wonderful rooms, some of them with great wallpapers and staircases and passageways and fortifications. And in those 3 castles, I managed to make all the rooms of the entire film: Italy, Naples, France, England. And in a gymnasium, I created the Old Bailey court, and also this little theatre where Oscar sings on the table. So it was very, very lucky to find those places, because rooms are great to work in, and they have a feeling all of their own. And once I got those rooms, the whole thing really kind of took shape.
Was there a particular scene you can recall that was challenging, either from the standpoint of performance or direction, something that you maybe struggled with a bit to try to find the right tone, the right style, the right balance?
I mean, the struggles just came from, the bigger scenes. The one that comes to mind is the scene in the Café Concert where I'm singing at the table, and it was a big scene with a singer, another singer, a band, dancers, a fight, me getting on the table and singing, and we had one day to shoot it in as opposed to 3 or 4, which we could have easily used, and just bringing that off and getting enough coverage and enough material in that scene was pretty tough and challenging, and also I didn't quite know how the scene would play and until it happened. So in one sense, I think that was probably the scene that was the most anxiety ridden.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Wilde's imprisonment, and I think one of the questions of making a movie like this is, well, what's its relevance to today? And certainly things are a little better than they were back then, but the LGBTQ community is still struggling with these kinds of issues of acceptance today. So I wonder, what do you believe the story of Oscar Wilde can tell us about the world that we live in today?
Well, first of all, it's a story that's only about halfway across the spectrum of today's global gay experience. So I think the historical context to this LGBTQ community is incredibly valuable, because it would actually make you think, God, we've made such enormous progress. We've made such huge amount of movement since 1900 to here. And I think without a historical context, we tend to have a more apocalyptic view of what we're living now. And so we tend to look at the challenges facing us now through a kind of apocalyptic lens. I think history can broaden that lens and bring in a slightly more empowered mindset. Because yes, of course, look what's happened in the last few weeks in America. Gay partners of diplomats refused visas, and now the transgender community really checkmated by President Trump in the passport thing. So we have to be very vigilant, and but we have the tide of history on our side, I believe, and I think there's a difference in the way we face the challenges of tomorrow is key. If we face it with an empowered viewpoint or with an apocalyptic viewpoint, the apocalyptic one is more complicated to deal with, I think. Mm-hmm. So I think a film like this is very relevant, if anything. Okay, it's a cartoon it's in the 19th century, but so some of our views still locked in the 19th century. So maybe it's not so cartoonish.
Yeah, I mean, I think we like to think that things are better now today than they were back in Oscar Wilde's time, and in a lot of ways they are, but in a lot of ways, we still have to be vigilant about that kind of thing.
Sexuality is still an enormous issue in our culture, and so I think for me it's definitely a film for Trump's America.
Absolutely. Before we go, I wanted to ask you, you've been nominated before by the Golden Globes for An Ideal Husband and Four Weddings and My Best Friend's Wedding, wrong British movie. That also brought you a BAFTA nomination. What has that recognition for your career meant for you?
It's wonderful to be nominated, and for people. It's wonderful when people like what you do. Period. I think it's obviously it helps you when it happens, and it gives you a lot of expectations. You're hoping that it might happen is always quite a exhausting process as well. I think what one has to fixate on or fix on is just the audience and hoping people appreciate the film. That's as far as I go, really.
Well, you've got another stellar one here. I'm glad to see that it finally made its way to the screens, because I think it's a wonderful and important movie for the time we live in. Rupert Everett, thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. So I push off now.
Oh no, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.